Hey everybody, welcome back. This is another majestic INFJ video. This is sort of a follow-up to my last video where I was attempting to explain FE and sort of a way to think of FE as a goal-oriented process where you're, again, trying to get from point A to point B, solving some sort of problem, but in the social domain, right? And so what you're achieving your goal through basically the use of people. You're figuring out, which various roles people should play. You might be using tactics to motivate them, to sort of get everybody maybe going in the same direction. Or maybe, figuring out who's the best person for the job. Building up hierarchies, figuring out the various roles that people should serve, given their strengths and weaknesses and various skills. That is what FE is all about. It is reading social dynamics and figuring out, okay, how do I achieve whatever goal I'm after using these social dynamics, okay? And it's similar in some ways, but also very different to TE, where TE is also goal-oriented. It's trying to achieve some sort of result, and it's trying to plan, how do you get from point A to point B and the various steps along the way. But it is in a different domain. It's not in the social domain or the domain of people. It's in the physical world domain, objects, abstract systems that aren't social. So if you got to fix a car engine or a dishwasher or something, or a leaky sink, it's very TE oriented. Object, it's figuring out the domain and the necessary steps and to getting the result you're looking for in the physical world. Now, that being said, I used an example of a real world problem where, like if you've got a flat tire, same problem, but an FE user and a TE user are going to go about it in maybe very different ways. So assuming that, you've got somebody has a flat tire, they've never had to deal with it before, nobody's ever taught them how to do this. It's a brand new problem that they have to face, but they have a general idea of, what's involved. A TE user, their attention is immediately going to focus on the mechanics of the issue. Do I have the right tools? What do I need to do, to actually work through the mechanics of going from point A to point B of changing the tire? And I, as an FE user, I can't even tell you what those steps will be, but the TE user, that's really what they're going to focus on. An FE user might be faced with the same problem, but they're going to do what I call domain shifting and shift it into a domain that works in the FE landscape. Instead of immediately focusing on the mechanics of the problem and whether or not they have the right tools and how to fix it, their attention is going to immediately shift to a social solution and make this into a social problem. And they're going to think, who do I call? Do I have a friend? Do I have a family member? Is there a service out there that will come and help me change this tire? It doesn't necessarily mean that they can't do it, right? They might just sort of bite the bullet and realize, okay, I'm going to have to, put on my TE hat here and do this myself. But it's not going to be their immediate reaction to the problem. And if they can solve it, through sort of more social dynamics, like calling up a friend, calling up somebody who can do this, and they'll turn on their FE and get that person to come out and help them out. They'll figure it out, right? So rather than expending the energy on figuring out the mechanics of how do I change this tire, they would rather spend their attentional resources and their mental energy on how do I convince somebody, or how do I get somebody out here to do this for me. Okay? Not to say that they can't do it, but they would rather spend their mental energy making it, solving it in the social domain as opposed to the physical domain. TE user, same thing. They might bite the bullet and say, okay, I'd really like to change this myself. I could figure it out, but I just don't have the right tools, or it's not safe, or whatever. And they might have to shift to more of an FE solution themselves, and they might not be happy about it, but then they'll have to sort of figure out, who do I call? And they might not have the FE skills to convince somebody to come out in the rain or whatever and help fix the tire. So that is just, a quick little example of how you can have the very same problem, but depending on sort of your cognitive, function stacking and your attentional mechanisms, you're going to go about solving it maybe in very different ways, okay? Now, this is particularly true for INFJs, ISFJs, INTJs, and ISTJs. And why is that? And that's because in the INFJ and the ISFJ, the extroverted feeling, FE function, is their tool function, okay? And so they go around the world sort of solving problems as they come up through social dynamics. Like, that's just sort of immediately how they think of solving a problem, because that's their tool function. Similar with INTJs and ISTJs, their tool function, or secondary function, is TE, extroverted thinking, and they go around the world sort of thinking about how to solve the world's problems through very mechanical and objective in the object sense, in the physical world sense. That's how they sort of think about solving problems, right? And not necessarily so much in the social domain, using people, okay? And so another concept to understand, to help you understand sort of the differences in how this domain switching works, is the concept of your polar function. So POLR, which is POLR, that stands for path of least resistance, that is basically your blind spot in a way. And to figure out it's basically the function that you kind of just, really shine your attentional spotlight on it, unless you just absolutely have to, and your back's sort of up against the wall. And even then, you're going to try to find some way to sort of compensate and shift it into maybe another domain to get the same result, but but by using a different function. And we'll talk about that in a second here. And so the polar function ends up being, it's sort of hard to explain. It's easy to visualize, but it's hard to explain in words. But think of it as it's the function that is in the opposite direction of your third function. So if you're an INFJ, your third function is introverted thinking, and so your polar function is going to be extroverted thinking. Another way to think of it is what is the corresponding function to your secondary function. So again, if you're an INFJ, your secondary function is FE, and the corresponding function is TE, okay? And and then you just flip that for INTJs and ISTJs. Their secondary function is TE, and so the corresponding function, which is their polar function, is FE, okay? Now, why is that? It's because, we rely so much on our secondary functions. If you're an INFJ, you rely so much on your FE that, again, you just try to solve all the world's problems in that domain. And, that's why they call it, basically your tool function. What do you use to sort of solve problems? And, when it comes to the judging functions, thinking and feeling. And then with the T, again, they sort of think of the world in, I'm going to use TE to fix every problem that I encounter. And so they, ignore the FE part of it, okay? So there's a lot to be said about that, but just, keep in mind that there's this function that's just sort of this blind spot, and it's because your secondary function is just so resource intensive, right? Your first function you just kind of do without really spending a whole lot of resources on it. Your secondary function, you got to spend some resources on it. And so what that does is it sort of creates this blind spot where you're not using resources, or it's very, very difficult to sort of focus resources on that polar function, okay? Hopefully that helps. And so that's why you see this domain flipping, okay? Couple of examples of where you see this pop up. First example is, for those of you in the typology community, you might be familiar with the channel Talking with Famous People, or host Eric. And I've actually done one of his typing sessions, and he posts his typing sessions online. And the way that he goes about trying to type people is to zero in on figuring out, okay, what's their polar function? And he's got various ways of doing this and various skills tests that he does to figure out, where people's sort of polar or attentional blind spot is. And so if you're an INFJ, he'll give you what he calls a TE test, where he sort of asks you to solve a TE problem, sort of like, fixing a flat tire. I think in my typing session, he asked me how to build a hot air balloon, And the funny thing is, and I don't know if he's noticed this or not, and, this is all just sort of anecdotal evidence, but I've seen it enough times to spot the pattern. If you've got an ISFJ or an INFJ, somebody who ends up being typed that, to where he finds them to be their polar spot to be TE. When he gives them the TE test, and I did this too. When he gives them the TE test, their very first reaction is, oh, I don't know, I'd call somebody, or I'd go to YouTube and watch a video and have an expert explain it to me. And so they take this TE problem that he's giving them, and they try to flip it into more of a FE problem, or an issue that could be solved in the social domain. I'd call my dad, I'd call my husband, I'd go watch a YouTube video and have some expert explain it to me, and hope that I can just follow along. So rather than spending the attentional resources on figuring out how to do, get from step one to step whatever, the TE polars, including myself, would rather spend the resources on shifting this into a social domain or a FE type of problem, okay? And the other way that you'll see this is actually sort of the opposite, where you've got INTJs and ISTJs, and their polar function is FE, right? So when faced with a problem or a goal in the social domain, they will try to flip it into sort of this kind of TE rules-based systems-based domain. And here's a couple of examples. So I'm a lawyer and started at a very big law firm that was, sort of a corporate, business-oriented law firm. And they attract a lot of ISTJs and a lot of INTJs because corporate law, in very large respects, is just, systems, process. Your goals are very, very systematic, very, process-based. And so ISTJs and INTJs just do great at very big law firms because it's just right up their alley. It's a lot of filling out paperwork and putting together checklists and just things that they just, excel at. However, when you first get hired and you join the firm, you've got to go to a bunch of social events where you've got to hang out with the partners and, especially like if you're a summer associate where it's sort of an interview that lasts the whole summer, and you go to a lot of these social events and, they want to make sure that, you're not a complete nutcase before they offer you a job. And, and then also in your first couple of years, you're doing a lot of sort of meeting the partners and going to these social events. And so because you have so many of these FE polar types, these ISTJs and INTJs, the older associates who are also probably themselves ISTJs and INTJs, and they went through the same thing, all of a sudden they become the experts on how to deal with these social events. And what they do is they create this very systematic, like these rule-based ways of behaving, because it just doesn't come automatically to them. I don't want to say intuitively because that's a different function, but it just doesn't come automatically to them, right? Of how to just sort of deal with social dynamics. And a lot of these people are fresh out of law school. They went to college and had some social interaction, but by and large, they were in the library a lot and haven't really had much social interaction. And so they come up with all these rules like never drink more than never have more than 2 beers, stick to beer, don't drink any sort of hard liquor. If you talk to a partner, try to limit it to 3 questions and then say, hey, it was really nice to meet you. I hope to work with you and blah, 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 and then leave, so that, you don't come across as annoying or, overbearing or anything. They'll give you questions to ask, ask them X, Y, and Z, and it's really funny to watch. And so you have all these ISTJs and INTJs who are trying to operate in the social domain, and there's a goal here, right? And that's to get hired and have people like you, or at least not like you, and to see you as a quality candidate and a quality lawyer, but they just don't have that sort of FE quality or focus, so they have to rely on all these little rules, right? And so it really is a lot of fun to watch these now that I'm a little older, and now I'm the partner that everybody's trying to not I guess trying to impress or to not impress. And so you have these little, you get the same questions from everybody, and they all sort of stand there holding their beer, and you could tell the people who don't like beer, but they'll drink it anyways because they were told to, and that was the rule. And so this is just another example of domain shifting, right? People, INTJs, ISTJs, they're phenomenal at TE work. They're really, really good, really quality associates and lawyers, But when it comes to the social stuff, there's this blind spot that they have to fill with these TE rules, and it's just kind of funny to see. But trust me, I have to fill a bunch of TE blind spots with my FE stuff. So I'm sort of doing it from the opposite direction. And then another example, and I just watched this video today. There's it's kind of an older video, I think, but I'll try to link it. I'll try to dig it up and link it down below. But it's a INTJ. He might be an ISTJ, but he's definitely FE polar. And he's sort of giving advice to younger INTJs. And again, it's very like rules based. It's very like, okay, if you have to do public speaking, pick 3 people and just focus on them, And so this very sort of robotic kind of, here's how you deal with this social interaction or this social problem. Rather than relying on your FE. And it's kind of funny because again, he's trying to systematize FE, and FE, even though it's sort of doing the same thing, it's trying to get you from point A to point B, there's a reason that there's a difference, right? People are different. People are dynamic. It's dealing with dynamics. It's dealing with hierarchies, not so much direct linear processes. So I think a TE is a little bit more linear and digital, right? You go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3, and you don't jump around. You don't go from step 1 to step 3, where FE, again, it's goal oriented, but it's more dynamic. It's more of a non-linear fluid dynamic thing, because you're dealing with people, and people are weird, and people sort of they'll fool you. You think you've got somebody figured out, that this is the right person for the job, and then it turns out they've got issues at home or some health issue, or just things change. It's a very, very fluid dynamic thing. And if you're an FE user, particularly a tool user, you've spent your whole life just sort of honing in on working in those dynamics and working with that fluidity, right? And so when you see the TE, or when you see somebody who's FE polar, you just get this sense that they don't have that fluidity, right, that FE users have. And it's not about charm or charisma or necessarily anything like that, because INTJs and ISTJs can be charming. They can be, I'm not trying to say they're robots or anything, but they just don't have that ability to sort of, adapt on the fly, or sort of read the room, so to speak, right, and deal with the different social dynamics. And so when they try to compensate for that FE, in these little social gatherings and everything, you see that systemization process pop up, and it's pretty interesting. So I just wanted to give these examples to sort of talk about the concept of domain switching, because a lot of times people will get confused, and they'll see somebody who, even if they're FE polar, sort of doing FE things, right? Laughing at jokes, and they get the quick little one-liners or something, that they saw in Mad Men, or something like that. But it's just very systematized, and it doesn't flow like what you see with the FE user. And it's the same, because I'm kind of TI polar, it's sort of hard for me to think about how how people with FE will overcompensate for their TE polarness, right? So But again, it typically involves, hey, if you want me to if you want me to fix this sink or this computer or mow the lawn or anything that's sort of process oriented or anything, how about we find an expert? And wouldn't it be better to just find somebody who does this for a living as an expert rather than me trying to figure this out? That's a very sort of effy way to solve life's little problems that come up. But of course, because we're sort of polar to it, we don't really think about it that way. We just sort of think like, just that'd be the best, way of going about things. And then if we've got to find somebody to help us, we'll turn on the FE. We will we'll figure out ways that, what do I need to pay you? Or, what can I do for you? And, all that kind of stuff. Because again, we're trying to accomplish some sort of goal. And, if the most appropriate tactic is, motivational or being charismatic or whatever, we'll do it. We'll do it to get to that goal. So, okay. Interested in hearing anybody else's thoughts. I really, just want to point out that, I'm really only talking about switching from FE to TE domain. There's probably similar ways of thinking about this with TI and FI, where people will sort of use, FI to sort of make up for TI and vice versa. But I think that's maybe not as obvious. So maybe we'll get into that. And then, there's also people where their polar function is one of the, perception functions, either intuition or sensing. And that's also a very interesting dynamic, right? Where somebody might use SI on a NI type of, something that requires NI to do, they will try to use SI to accomplish whatever it is that you're trying to do. Again, this isn't goal oriented so much as what knowledge base do you use, and we could talk about that in a follow-up video. Okay, interested in any other examples people might have, and maybe I'll follow up with some other examples with other functions and other types of polar functions and how they're not overcompensated, but how people sort of fill in their blind spot by using a different function to achieve the same result. Okay, great. Talk to you next time. Bye.